So here we go. Well, Don, thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to talk to us. So I would love if you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and give us some context for you.
All right. Well, context for me, I'm a weird one. I grew up in West Michigan in the what we always call the Northern Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Deep red county, RCA, Reformed Church in America, born and raised, and super conservative, that whole area. I went to college, Hope College, another very conservative Christian institution, did all the bona fides of your typical conservative Christian in those days. And I got married, and I did not have the easiest time graduating college, not academically speaking, but mostly money speaking. I grew up definitely on the poor side. I'd always wanted to be in ministry, but there wasn't really an easy way to get there. And by the grace of my father-in-law and a professor of mine who was very kind, I was able to get through undergrad, and I wound up with a position as a missionary, which I figured, hey, all right, if I can't be a pastor, I'll give a crack at being a missionary. Moved to Japan, was there for about 5-6 years, and no, excuse me, about 4 or 5 years, and had the opportunity to go to Princeton to get an MDiv, just kind of pop up out of nowhere, unexpectedly. I didn't think I'd be able to pull that off, but we prayed about it. We took a crack at it, and it seemed like the pathway to being a pastor was open. But for me, that created a little bit of a conundrum. You see, I had spent most of my life in the RCA, which I don't know if you're familiar with the denomination so much, is not the most accepting of places, at least on the denominational level. But I didn't agree with that. And so when the opportunity came to go to seminary, I said, you know what? I need to get a fresh start. And so I left the RCA and I joined up with the PCUSA for a time. Because I liked where they were in terms of denominational polity. I liked where they were in terms of their social justice and the real public commitment to being open and affirming, while still being generally Reformed Christianity. It seemed like a good fit to me. I once joked that it was between the ELCA and the PCUSA, and I decided on the PCUSA because I look better in black. But when it comes down to it, I went with the PCUSA, and I did my years in seminary, and I didn't have a good time with the PCUSA's ordination process. We didn't come to agreement, not on social issues, but on more missional issues. I've always felt called to serve internationally rather than in specific, local white congregations in the U.S. And that's what they were really looking for, at least the Presbyterian I was connected with. And so eventually we parted ways. Fortunately for me, at the same time, I had reconnected with I don't suppose you could say divergent branch, but definitely the black sheep of the RCA family, which is the classist New Brunswick, which has got some of the most open. Everybody in there is open and affirming. They are the most Presbyterian of the Reformed Church, I guess you could say. And they welcomed me back with open arms, and I went through the RCA's process with them. The occasional bump as one has, and I was ordained in 2019. And my wife is currently in the process for ordination herself, also in ministry. And we moved shortly thereafter. And when I say shortly, I mean about 9 hours after my ordination, we moved to Japan again. At the moment, we were originally called for my wife and I to serve a local union church out here. But they're in the midst of some transitions, and it was decided that it would be better for me to pursue other options. So I got together with some folk from my denomination and some folks I've been talking with for a long time who have had an impossible time of finding a church home. People who've been hurt by the church, people who've been pushed out on the fringes of religious society, people with belief, but people who've been hurt by the church as an institution. And we hit upon this idea of doing what we call a church home for the church homeless, an internet-based church where anybody's welcome, where we're modeling our structure, not necessarily after what's worked for churches in the past, but over what those of us who've been pushed out by the church in the past or still are being pushed out by the church have found ways to connect with. So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit weird, but that's where I'm at right now. So a bit of a long story, but I hope I hit the salient points for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was great. So I'm curious about this church for the churchless, right?
Mhm.
This, you said that you don't use the things or don't do the things that made churches successful in the past, right? So can you tell me, what does that look like?
Well, admittedly, we're still figuring a lot of it out.
Sure.
Actually, I just recently did a bit on our YouTube channel about this. And I talked about how, when I was a kid in, that Bible Belt area,
Mhm.
or the Northern Bible Belt,
Mhm.
it always used to confuse the heck out of me that I would read the Bible and I would hear justice and mercy and love, and then I'd go to church and I'd get fire and brimstone and judgment off the
Mhm.
pulpit. But then
Mhm.
I'd turn around and I'd go home and I'd turn on to Comedy Central and there'd be Jon Stewart with justice and mercy and love.
Right.
And so as I've been talking to folk, we've been looking at, we started by looking at the comedy groups, but we started looking at fandoms in general and how they're organized. And every fan group we've looked at, from, my home turf of the Star Trek fandoms, because, hey, I'm nothing if not a sci-fi geek, to anime conventions, to the whole deal. And they all seem to operate on similar principles. You've got a wide media distribution net, a smaller community with a dedicated, usually a Discord server, and then connected Facebook groups and things like that. And there is, if you go in those places, there's real, authentic, functional community that's happening in there.
Mhm.
And rather than getting together for a regimented time of corporate interaction, the fellowship is the key in these groups, to use our own terminology. The community is key. And then the other media pieces are around that. And so we started trying to mimic that model rather than trying to build a physically local church and then branch out from there.
Mhm.
Because most of the people we're talking to, people who've been kicked out of church, they did exactly what I did back in the day. And they went to, to anime or to games or to comedians or something and found their communities there. So
Right.
trying to build something that they're more comfortable with.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing that you're doing church online, right? And now everybody's forced to do church online. And I'm
Yeah.
assuming you all started this pre-COVID. Yeah.
Well, it's been an idea I've been playing with for about 5 years. We've had a couple of attempts to start it, which have mostly been limited by the fact that I have this pesky need to eat and feed my children and have housing. So I've had to do other jobs too, and that's limited my availability. But right now we're in a place where I have enough time to start laying down the mechanics and the fundamentals and build it up as an actual organization.
Mhm.
And so now we're leaning into it more properly, and it's really starting to pick up a little bit.
Mhm.
But the general theory behind it is something I've been on for several years, because I really believe, as someone who grew up in the anime, the video game, the comedy groups, and the Star Treks, that sometimes you find more authentic community in the internet places than you do in your church.
Yeah. It's so true. I mean, can you, I think that point right there really strikes a chord with me. Can you say a little bit more about the types of community that you've seen in church that you would describe as less authentic or inauthentic, and describe what kinds of authentic community, like what did that look like for you? How did you know that you found it?
Well, I grew up as a musician in the middle of the RCA's great battle between classical music and praise music.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I I, as is weird for someone who's younger than the age of 60, I was always hardcore on the side of the classical music. Give me an organ any day, man, and I'm at home. But what got me is that both sides of that particular argument were performative in how they wanted to do church.
Mm,
Your praise band people wanted the praise band to be front and center, to have everybody looking at them and to be rocking out like they were a rock group. And your classical musicians wanted to treat it like a classical concert where everybody clapped when they were done and gave them their propers.
right.
And as I began to look from that and look out into the whole church, I saw that for all that there was genuine fellowship and community present, there was this great performative mask over all of it. Everybody had to be dressed just so. Everybody had to make sure that they kept to even stricter social norms than you might otherwise. And you could be part of the team as long as you didn't XYZ. And God help you if you drop the occasional F-bomb.
Yeah.
Which, ruled me out from the start. One of my big bad habits there. But so as I began to notice that, and then I turn around and I look at, because this was the late 90s, back when we were still doing with like AOL and the late days of the BBS messaging boards and stuff like that, these early communities, and then you go to conventions and stuff like that. And to put it bluntly, everybody's a freak and nobody cares. And that's the mentality, because everyone in those places has embraced the differences that define them.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind, because the more I interacted with that, the more I realized, wait, this is what church is supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I talk about authentic community, we have in our community, I've been a big fan of blunt honesty in approaching topics, particularly those topics that we don't normally discuss in church. We have a thread on our Discord server that is specifically for talking about Christian sexuality. God help you if you ever find that in a pulpit in a typical church. Song of Solomon has come up a few times for us, and we're okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing for us is to be authentic. You have to be willing to embrace the weird stuff, the questions that we all have, because we have questions.
Mm-hmm.
And there is conflict that arises out of that sometimes, but it is, I think, better embraced than avoided.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, something that you said that I found very interesting is the notion of church as performance. Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I came from a Southern Baptist context originally.
Okay.
In the Deep South.
So well.
Yep, it was all about performance, not just at church, but everywhere. Everywhere was church, basically. Mm-hmm. You were always on your church behavior, because somebody was watching. Eventually, when my mom married my stepdad, we didn't really go to church anymore. But once I did start going to church again, it was a non-denominational, charismatic church. Okay. And then I ended up going to an Assemblies of God university and became an Assemblies of God pastor. So I know all about church's performance. But yeah, I find it so interesting, right, that we create these spaces, right, that we talk about God loves you, you're embraced as you are, come as you are, just as I am, that hymn, right, this sense of like, we say that, but we don't really create those spaces where that's true.
Yeah, and I was just having a discussion with a colleague of mine last night, actually, about this exact issue, about how we embrace the theory but shun the practice. Mm-hmm. And that's the devil of church as an institution. Is this is something I've honestly learned a lot about by living and working in Japan as much as I have, is Americans, we have a real hard time with embracing a collectivist mindset of thinking about the good of the group. We talk a good game, but we are just objectively terrible at long-term thinking beyond ourselves. And I say this as an American, like I am not putting myself beyond this paradigm. I'm horrible at this too. But embracing that collectivist mindset is how we get to Christian community.
Mm-hmm. What does that look like in practice?
Oh God, I don't know. But I did just say I'm American after all. I think you want to talk about the practice. I think it's as much a journey as knowing for sure. And this is something I always try to caution people about, is I am the epitome of the thing I speak against. I'm great at talking to the king. That comes natural to me. I come from 2-3 generations of salesmen. It's built in. I couldn't stop it if I wanted to. Yeah. But I do so firmly believe, and this comes from my background in teaching as well, that we don't get to a place by sitting still forever and concocting the perfect image of where we need to go. We get to a place by stumbling haltingly forward, making as many mistakes as we possibly can, screwing it up, hurting ourselves, hurting other people, and then practicing fixing that.
Yeah. Right.
It's not a process of doing no harm. It's a process of knowing how to heal when you inevitably do harm, because we are all broken, sinful humans who are going to screw up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting idea, right? Knowing how to heal when we do harm, right? Because we will inevitably cause harm, right? I totally
Exactly.
on board with you there. What do you think? I mean, what have you found in your own communities when harm has been done? What has healing looked like?
Well, I'm always hesitant to answer that as a blanket, because you say, what does healing look like? And I can say, honestly, it's still in progress.
Yeah.
Without naming names, within our community, we've got a couple of members of the LGBT community,
Mm,
but we also have a couple of old school conservatives who are really trying to be on the right side of history. But we're also talking about older folk who have a certain vocabulary and worldview that they're just not going to shake.
mhm,
And there have been explosive moments in some of our community conversations where people are angry, and rightfully so, because your old school conservative folk are like, why do you have to keep coming at me this way? And then the other side, like, you're literally just blanket disavowing my humanity. And if you want to have a real community, like a real authentic community, as much as it is important to provide spaces of safety and acceptance for everybody, you can't have a real community for everybody without having people that have hatefully conflicting views.
mhm.
It's just where America is right now, where the world is right now, it's not going to be a thing. So we've had our explosive moments, and sometimes we part ways in that explosive moment, but everyone in our community has a commitment, when tempers cool down, to come back and talk it out. It's the same thing I do, as condescending as it sounds, with my children. I've got all of my children are under the age of 10, and so, as you can imagine, they're fist fighting about every 10 minutes. Um, Especially when two of my children are boys, and oh man, they are trying to knock each other out. And sometimes they can resolve it in the moment. Sometimes they can't and have to be separated. But we as a family have a commitment that whatever happens, we come back later and we talk it out,
Mm.
because we're committed to the process of healing and reconciliation, not to the immediate end goal. God, we Christians talk a great game about reconciliation, but when we talk about it, we want it to be a thing that has happened, not a thing that is happening.
Mm. For sure. I mean, I think it's much more difficult to sit in that space of the not yet reconciled space.
Oh, God, it's a pain.
And I think the other challenge is, I mean, so in my other world, I'm studying to become a therapist.
Okay.
Um, so right now I'm in a trauma class, so everything to me is trauma, trauma, trauma. I'm like looking at everything through a trauma lens right now. And I'm specifically doing my final project on religious trauma.
Mm.
So, I mean, I think one of the most challenging things is like just our language within Christianity. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Oh,
have
man.
been on like the spectrum of, uber conservative, like, and been like leader in that world, like
Mm.
someone who was creating that culture. And now on the other, like a United Church of Christ minister, the joke
Yeah.
is we're just Unitarians considering Christ, like on the other end of the spectrum, basically. And I still feel at times though, like the language doesn't change a whole lot, right? Like the
Yeah.
liturgy picks up on the same, like, even though people would say, oh, I don't believe in substitutionary atonement,
But it's
you're
still all
using
in there.
that same language. I feel like for me at times, it feels so it just brings up so much old pain, and it feels
Yeah.
like I can't redeem this. I don't even know how to reconcile this within my own self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is actually, you're hearkening to a conversation I had with one of my congregants just, geez, like 3-4 days ago, about what's important in our ritual, in our liturgy, in all of these pieces. Everything from the complex liturgies of the sacraments, all the way to the simple act of parental analogies for God.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
And when it comes down to it, what is God? God is an indescribable transtemporal something that we can't understand if we
Right.
tried.
Right.
Therefore, everything we have to say about God from the Bible on forward it's an archetypical framework. It's a structure that we built in order to not necessarily put bounds on God, but to use as a tool so that we can connect.
Mhm.
And these tools have endured for so long because they have a broad usability. Like, I'm not going to crap on tradition here, because I do believe that tradition has its uses. We've used them for centuries because anywhere between 60 and 80% of the population gets a real use out of it. But when it comes to our traditions and our practices and our everything but our core beliefs, really, it's utility that defines. And if, calling God the Father is actually helpful to you, I may have some questions about where you are socially, but, more power to you. If that's helpful for you in your own individual journey. If it's not a deal breaker. Most of this stuff isn't a deal breaker. As much as we have our councils and our synods getting together and saying, we have to make sure to have communion on X day and Y day. We have to make sure to practice baptism in this very particular way. And I'm just sitting back here saying, baptism is a ritual we invented in the first century. It's not actually like biblically attested. Like, we can play with that. We're totally allowed to do that. So all of these things are defined by their utility in the connecting of our limited human understandings to a faith in something that is primarily incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. So, I'm talking with a congregant of mine about the possibility of doing a baptism in our community, and finding that balance between that traditional language and practice that has meaning because my father did it before me and his father before him, et cetera, or mother, or however you connect there. That has some validity and meaning because of the history behind it. But having to balance that between that and that history hurt me it's a tightrope act. And ministerially, I'm a firm believer in the fact that we have to be the ones who are willing to be flexible. Mm-hmm. We have to be the ones who are willing to say, yeah, almost all of this is up for grabs, not because we have an unstable faith, but quite the opposite, because our faith is strong enough that the details, you can play with them if you want. It's not going to change how my faith operates. It's not going to change how our faith operates, because our faith is in a God who is bigger than literally all of this.
Right.
Sorry, you got me preaching there for a second.
No, for sure, that's where I'm at, right? Like, for me, it's like, well, we just made this up at some point along the journey anyway to make sense of what was happening, right? And for me, all theology is contextual, right? Everything is birthed out of some context in order to make sense and make meaning in that moment. And so it would naturally make sense to me that in a new context, we might need to make new meaning or different meaning, right? And so we might need to use different language or rituals or whatever. I think one of my big struggles, though, is the institutions are not flexible.
Yeah. And that is, I have divided opinions on that, I'll be honest. If you had caught me 10 years ago, I would have been like, yeah, institutions are terrible. They need to be burnt down, and we need to all go off and do our own thing. Death to the institutions. Done like a Wharf in that baseball episode. Death to the opposition. That'd have been me all the way.
Yeah.
But, having spent my time with, the Classis New Brunswick that I'm connected with, which blew me away in being an institution that works. Mm-hmm. And actually succeeds in doing justice and loving kindness and walking at least a modicum of humility. I'm not going to say humbly all the way, because there's some proud people from time to time. Having been connected to an institution like that, and having seen how institutional polity and structure can be used as a tool to advance the goals of a loving and caring community, I actually do believe that institutional Christianity has a use. I believe that institutional Christianity has been brutally poisoned over the last 100 years or so. and it wasn't in the greatest shape to begin with. So we're talking about a tool here that is busted, but I don't think necessarily busted beyond repair.
So I noticed you said 100 years or so. What do you think what it was in the last 100 years that changed?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think if I were to put a point on it, it'd be something that starts with the letter A and ends with Murica. Um, Honestly, American nationalism in the way, more than 100 years definitely, but the way it has leaned so heavily on making church into a nationalist institution.
Yeah.
And the way that it's embraced this kind of almost dissociative, selfish, individual driven kind of the pseudo evangelical movement, if you will. All of these things, yeah, they've been in my own admittedly limited studies of history. This seems to be one of the biggest damages done to institutional Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's damaging in its subtlety. We talk about things like the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades and stuff like that. Yeah, they were definitely damaging to the reputation of the faith and to the internals of our own faith journeys as an institution, because we were doing terrible things. But they were big and they were bold and they were obvious. And this one has been a slow corrosion over the period of a century or more. And the subtlety of that, the gradual bending of the moral arc of the church as far away from justice as possible, that has been disastrous to
Mm-hmm.
the work of Christ in America in general and in the world in specific. I mean, even in my time as a missionary out here in Japan, the biggest question that I had to contend with whenever I told someone I'm a Christian, they said, "Wait, aren't you the guys who hate gay people?" It's like, oh, Lord, no, but also, oh, God. Yeah. So, yeah, I totally am a believer in the fact that it is salvageable, but the amount of work that it's going to require to do to salvage it is daunting, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of me almost feels like too, until certain uh, strata of leadership die out altogether, I'm not sure how much change there can be.
A part of me, I definitely agree with that. But I have also seen in people I know, hell, and people in my own family, the power of the redemption of a boomer, if you will.
That's true.
When a boomer steps forward and says, "You know what? I have held this belief for 50 years, and I see now that it is incompatible with Christ." Like for every young person who's come to Christ and said, my involvement with Jesus Christ has really made me feel loved and accepted and welcome. For every one of those, which is a wonderful thing, a person who has espoused a terrible thing and then reconciled for it. There's a reason why the prodigal son is such a big story for us. It's not the loving and dedicated son isn't the one that God rejoices for. And that's honestly for a lot of us. Like I get the yeah, we just gotta wait for the boomers to die off. I get that mentality. Oh boy, do I get it. It would be easier, but as much as I hate it sometimes, and it what we're called to preach.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that there's still work that can be done.
Yeah.
I just think that there, I mean, a framework that I think is helpful for me is thinking about like Ibram Kendi's anti-racism framework,
Okay.
right? He doesn't say that we live in a land of progress. He says we live in a land that has progress and anti-progress, that there are two things simultaneously happening, right? That there's always a both and, it's not an either or.
Yeah.
And even within ourselves, right, we are complex and we have both, right? Things that move us into health and healing and connection. And we have things within us that move us into the exact opposite space. And so I think being able to hold that tension, and I think for me, it's constantly asking, like, well, coming from my own background, I think a lot of it has to do for me with like recognizing how in the church spaces I was in, lots of it was about dissociating, right? It was about
Yeah.
disconnecting from reality, disconnecting from self, using
Right.
religion as a spiritual bypass. So for me, it's often the question of like, am I connecting to myself? Am I connecting to what's going on right now?
Right.
Am I able to really be here now? And then
Yeah.
connect to others in that moment. And I think what I often find and feel, I mean, I find my own self, like I'm still dealing with the wounds of, you know, having so much anxiety and not being able to be here now. Right? Like that for
Yeah.
me, I think will be years of work, inner work to really deal with that. But
Yeah.
also, I find that difficulty. I do think there is a generational divide too about uh, mental health, for instance, right? And
Mm.
like how we understand mental health, and like especially in the South, you know, where I come from, there's certainly a sense of like the older generation, they love that spiritual bypassing. It's like
Mm.
what got them through, you know,
Yeah.
and so it's hard to like have conversations about moving beyond that.
Yeah.
But I
And
do
that's,
think there is hope for change. But
yeah. And that is, it is a really complicated situation. I love that you bring mental health into it as well, because, our field in ministry overlaps with mental health just so much. And that bypass that you talk about, it is, it's one of the greatest temptations I've seen
mhm.
for a lot of people, even not your super conservative,
Oh, yeah.
people from that background, the belief that if I just pray about it, God will take care of
Hmm.
it. And I've talked about this a few times in sermons. This belief that Thy will be done means throw it up to God and let the Almighty take care of it, and not Thy will be done, so I will get to work on doing Thy will. We see it bluntly in the things you talk about, like the spiritual bypass. Like I knew of a guy who was dealing with a severe mental illness and had a pastor who was of that inclination come to him, sit with him for 5 minutes, say, "You're possessed by a demon. I'm gonna praise be to the Lord. You're healed," and then leave. And he wanted to believe that. Like he really wanted to believe that that fixed the problem. Totally solution oriented, and it doesn't work that way. And as anyone who studied mental health or psychology, as I'm sure you know, that all of it is a process, and our faith has to accept that as much as our psychology there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's challenging too. Like when we read narratives of Jesus healing people and it's instantaneous in the text, right?
You know,
How do we, again, I mean, this is part of our work, I think, as ministers, right? Is we are interpreters of tradition, right?
yeah,
We are helping to expound upon how we see this in our world here and now.
yeah.
And how do you deal with things like that?
Well, I've had these conversations a few times. When someone says, "How do you say that instantaneous miraculous healing isn't really a thing, but yet you see Jesus do it in the Bible all the time. How do you reckon with that?" The first question I usually ask is, now I don't mean to be unkind, but are you Jesus? Not to put too fine a point on it. I don't generally believe that Jesus's miraculous healing acts, which I do honestly believe that Jesus did. I don't necessarily believe that they were meant to be instructive for us in that way. That they weren't supposed to be a case of, here, I did it, so you can too. They were meant to be, I think, for us, instructive in the sense of, look, this is what the end result looks like. Now let's talk process. Like, I can snap my fingers and show you what the end result looks like. Like any teacher in any class who writes a completed sentence on the board to show you what your finished product should look like first. And, there may be situations where, the Lord Almighty, like a teacher frustrated with that student who just can't seem to get his grammar right, finally just steps in and says, "Look, I'll fix it for you. Here, you write this and you will be correct." The miracle probably does happen from time to time, but I believe in general, what the Lord wants us to do is use our intellect, use our abilities that God has given us and figure out how to build the thing that he's shown us, in Jesus Christ. So that's my approach to it anyway. It may be a bit heretical from time to time, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would not fly with Pentecostals.
No, it would not.
Pentecostals would be throwing, but Jesus said, "Greater works would you do in my name." That the book of Acts is filled with the disciples continuing his work of
Yeah,
miracles.
and again, context is key.
Yeah, for sure.
The disciples were in a very particular time, in a very particular place, and the needs of the Almighty in that situation. I can't speak for God because, as you may have noticed, I am not God. The needs of God in that particular place may have been to imbue people with the ability to do miracles, but I don't believe that that's an eternal constant, that everybody can do that if they just believe. And that harkens to what I think is a larger issue, is this belief that if you believe hard enough, you can do and or have anything you want. This belief that I can perform miracles if my faith is strong enough, it is a stone's gentle toss away from prosperity gospelism. Sure. The belief that if my faith is significant, I can have whatever I want. And what you get and what you're able to do in God and with God has nothing to do with the strength of your faith. It has everything to do with what God's trying to do in a particular situation. And truth be told, if you think you know what God's trying to do in a particular situation, then I have some questions for you, because I don't think anybody can really fully know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting, right? Mm-hmm. How we perceive how God is at work in the world here and now.
Yeah. And don't mistake, by the way, my very, I would say, generous to myself, of course, very down-to-earth approach to theology. Don't mistake that for a lack of belief in the more supernatural elements of the faith. I believe that there is so much in who we are as divine beings and who we are spiritually that is left to explore, that is unexplored, and that can't be explored. And there's always a part of me that's hesitant to say miracles don't exist, which I don't believe they don't exist. I believe that they're rarer than we give them credit for, but I think that the spiritual needs to be approached with caution. That the mystic and the ephemeral and the someone once called me the crazy weird needs to be approached with caution, because as pattern-loving humans, we are very, very quick. We think of ourselves as hugely intellectual, but we are super quick to attribute divinity to something explicable. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like, you look at a natural disaster that came as a result of global warming, you're like, it must be God. Like, no, it's because you keep burning half the planet. Stop doing that. And then that won't happen. And so I'm always cautious about attributing too much divinity. And that's why I think discernment is a necessary process. But boy, you've gotten me into my theology ranting again.
Yeah. Well, while we're on the topic of theology, I wonder how, like, in your journey, what do you feel like are some of the major shifts that you've made in terms of how you think about God, how you relate to God, how you do think about what God is doing in the world?
Well, as I said, I'm always hesitant to describe things in terms of major shifts, because for me, the journey's always been a gradual one. Like opening your eyes and realizing more and more as you do. My first real moment of realization was probably when I was, I think, like 6th or 7th grade. And this, coming from your background, I think you'll be familiar with this sort of mindset. I had gotten this big old lecture in Sunday school about how, these crazy schools were banning the Bible and you couldn't even bring it in or else you'd get in all kinds of trouble. And me being the totally peaceful, cooperative individual that I totally definitely am, decided, oh, well, if that's the case, I'm gonna bring my Bible for silent reading every day from now on. And let's see if they call me out on that. And I was looking forward to it because I'm thinking, yeah, we're gonna get into a conflict here. I know what the law is. We're gonna have us a little bit of a tussle with the administration, and then the church is gonna come and prevail, and God will be like, "Hooray, you did a great thing!" And I brought my Bible to school for silent reading, and I propped it up, and I sat down and I started reading and listened for the loud sound of absolutely no one caring. And so then I was stuck because I couldn't just like throw it away and pick up a Star Trek novel because it seemed like I wasn't committed. It seemed like it was just a bit, which I really didn't want it to be just a bit. Or alternatively, I'd have to do something that, like a lot of people with a conservative background, I'd been avoiding for a very long time, which was actually read the thing. And that was, in seventh grade, after being a Christian for my life to date, that was the first time I actually read the book. And I remember reading through Isaiah. I started with Revelation because I was a seventh grader who grew up in a conservative church, so of course I did. And I remember reading that and thinking, this seems a bit more overblown and weird than I've been led to believe. This is not nearly as play by play as I've been told.
Right.
And then I remember flipping into like Isaiah and some of the Old Testament stuff and thinking, okay, wow, this is not the condemnative kind of our group is the best literature I've been led to believe. There's something totally different going on here. And for me, that was a process of a year where I didn't stop bringing the Bible in with me. It started out as a bit, but as I started digging into it, I'm like, okay, well, what? Wait, Jesus actually said that? You've got to be kidding. Why has nobody told me about this? And from then on, it was a process of keeping that as a root and just encountering the world of the church and the world of the people beyond it. And that became my measuring stick. When I would go to church and the pastor would preach about how people who gamble are sinners and we need to push them out of our community. That was a big thing for my pastor in those days. I don't know why. And I would be like, hold on. Like, aren't there like 9 different verses here that talk about accepting people and welcoming them into the community, even if X? How does that track with what he's saying? And then I would, as I've talked before, I'd go out and I'd look at the comedians and I'd look at other communities who were saying, look, we got to do things that are here to help people. And I'd look at my Bible and be like, oh, this is lined up with that. And that began a whole process that spanned my entire life of trying to, I guess I could call it redoing the mental filing. Picking, okay, this was in the file cabinet of that's right. And oh boy, that's about condemning gay people. That needs to be in the circular file bin over here. And this one over here that was about loving your neighbor, I put that in the trash because that was all like contextual social theology, but that matches right up with the book of Matthew. So that's going to have to go back. Whole process, and it's still going on. I remember all sorts of bits and pieces. I mean, I can define it by books. I've got so many books just sitting right next to me. Like, and the day I read, the day I read that one, that was a big one. Of course, my favorite here. If you've ever come across this one, here we go.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, Toyohiko Kagawa, probably my favorite theologian. This guy was known, I'll give you a little background. He was known as the Gandhi of Japan. That's kind of how he was known in the West. He was famous for the creation of a practical theology that was based on feeding people, living in the slums, and taking care of people. He was a poet and a theologian. I'll read you this quote that I always have to hand about him. And I think I put this in pretty much every research paper I've written since I found out about the guy, because it is a definition, I think, of what I think it means to be a preacher and to be a pastor in God. So if you don't mind, I'll read that one to you.
Yeah.
It says here, it's on Love the Law of Life, in his prologue. It says, I stand against all learning, all institutions, all governments, all arts, all religions which reject love. I protest against every so-called church which preaches faith and fails to love. I oppose the politicians who rely on force and know nothing about love. If I have to be arrested for saying this, let me be handcuffed, for I had rather die quickly by the sword than die of thirst in a loveless desert. And the whole book goes on in that way. And, spoiler warning, he was in fact arrested shortly thereafter. because this was early World War II era Japan. Because, so, of course he was. But that right there is, I think, what the core of Christian theology is.
Mm-hmm.
Is we stake our case on love. We reject anything that isn't, and we accept everything that is. And everything has to be run through that filter. And if it doesn't pass muster, we got to examine why in the name of not actually God we're doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, that's so crucial that I always try to explain to people like everybody's reading things through a lens, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's conscious or unconscious, all of us have lenses that we've learned to read things through. And I
Yeah.
think for me, looking at Jesus, the way that the gospel writers portray Jesus, Jesus is using a lens to read the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
Jesus isn't quoting from Joshua. He's not quoting about, going in and slaughtering whole villages. Jesus is
Yeah.
very specific in the way that he reads the scriptures.
Yeah. And that's really important too. I don't know if you're familiar with, I follow her on Twitter, Rabbi Danya Rutenberg. I don't know if you followed anything by her. Jewish rabbi, very active in Reform Judaism. And she did this very, very long explanation of I suppose you say the academic and training lens in which Jesus would have operated, the two different schools of Pharisees at the time. And, it's, of course, from a Jewish perspective, it wasn't necessarily written with the idea of Jesus as Messiah, but it was definitely looking at the teachings of Jesus as, wow, this is coincidentally very much in line with what this exact school of Pharisees that he was exactly a member of seems to be saying. And so there is very much a lens and a context of Jesus's teachings too. Like he was trained in this particular way because God put him in that place, because God said, hey, these guys generally have the right idea. Let's put some Jesus in it and see if we can't kick it up to 11. My belief, of course, and I don't want to be seen like I'm hijacking a Jewish approach either, but I did find her explanation of Jesus' background in that way contextually informing anyway.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, for sure. I think for me, the more that we can humanize Jesus and recognize his own journey, I think, I certainly have a much lower Christology than a lot of people. So, but I think being able to connect with that Jesus for me is so radical. Even just like this year at church, I've been preaching more through the Gospels as we go through the lectionary, and just being able to see how radical Jesus is amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's not just radical, but radical as a human.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you hit on something very key there is this, a mentor of mine once maintained that if God wanted us to embrace the divine and reject our humanity, then Jesus would have been incarnate as a pillar of fire again or something. The reason God chose to incarnate in a human was because of an embrace of humanity, not a rejection.
Right.
And so, like in Jesus, we can understand a lot of things he did in a lot of different ways. My favorite take was to look at Jesus and the fig tree, right?
Mm.
You know the story I mean, where he walks out, that fig tree has no fruit, and he basically just divinely blows it up. Like, I see in that a lesson about bearing fruit. I see in that a lot of the other things we traditionally approach in it. But I also see a guy who got up in the morning and was really grumpy and just like nuked a fig tree because he's human and he's grumpy in the mornings. Like,
Mm.
these are all pieces of the scenario that involves who Jesus is. And to reject one in favor of the other is to reject what God was trying to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the Gospels are very much an embrace of our humanity, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think for me, the whole metaphor of, right, Jesus dying for our sins is really a message of God's embrace.
Mm.
That, like, you already are. Like, you don't need to be something else. You already are what you need to be.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
like, that's for me, I think, what I connect so much within, like, the therapeutic training versus, like, uh, a lot of theology is it's like in psychology, we're just really trying to examine what's going on for you as a human. We're
Mm-hmm.
not trying to argue against it or say, well, that's not human. We're trying to say, like, what's going on? And to
Mm-hmm.
understand that behavior is contextual, that
Yeah,
there's some kind of context. And if we can help you name the context and label what's happening, we might be able to help you move more fully into the depth of who you are.
yeah. I'm I'm going to tell you something very personal here. I don't share it with a lot of people. What the heck? I'm going to share this one publicly here for a minute. Why not? But I think it speaks to a lot of what you're saying. I'm going to reach out and connect with our Pentecostal and charismatic friends here for a moment, and I'm going to talk to you about a dream I had that one time.
Mm,
I'm not normally a believer in the big mystic stuff, but we all have those moments, right? Where we have that one dream that we're like, yeah, that was definitely a thing. And I had one of those where I could, I guess you would describe it as heaven, but definitely where it was a place where I was in the presence of God, and in that place were many people that I had known or would come to know in my life, and I remember meeting in this place of all people my ex fiance and her violently deranged late father. I mean, this was a man who had just been threatened me with firearms, like old crazy Michigan people tend to be. This was a guy who like drunk and smoked and died of like 6 different types of cancer because of the drinking and the smoking. Not the sort of guy that you would imagine to be a very traditionally moral person. And his daughter was not in the way I interact with her particularly different. But in that space, the easiest way to describe it is that they looked different. And it took me a while of processing this to understand what my brain was interpreting, is what I was seeing was the actual person. And that what had happened is that the people I knew in life had passed through into God's presence, and all that was sinful and evil had been burned off, purified in that process. And what I was seeing was what was on the other side, what was left at the end. And to me, that's always been how I've understood, heaven and the afterlife and stuff like that. And our goal in reaching that, in as much as we can be heaven oriented in a practical world, is to make sure that there's enough good in us that there's something left on the other side. But it also gave me an insight into what it means to understand people, because at everybody's core is that perfect person who God has designed and made and is wonderful. And living in this world is like a penguin in an oil slick. We've got that sin, our sin, the sin of other people's, the capital S sin that rolls down through history, all kind of hanging on and around and about us. And the goal of a Christian in this environment, I think, is to be able to take a cloth and wipe a little bit of that oil slick off the face a little bit and look at someone and say, I see you. Anyway, that's my kind of take on that.
yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, for me, like that phrase, I see you,
Mhm.
like, I see you, I believe you. I believe that there's real goodness and beauty and truth inside of you.
Yeah,
And I am willing to be moved by your experiences.
exactly.
Like, I think so in trauma care.
Mhm.
I mean, my professor is a trauma specialist. She would argue that at the end of the day, what really is so trauma doesn't occur, she would argue, because something bad happened to you. Trauma
Yeah,
occurs because, I mean, aside from like the neurological stuff, but she would say at the end of the day, it's because we didn't have the psychological resources to cope with what was happening. And
yeah,
usually those resources come from others mirroring back to us.
yeah.
We are able to have a witness, somebody who's able to say,
Mhm.
I see you, I believe you, and I'm willing to be moved by what you're telling me.
Yeah,
And so it's So the healing comes with you being able to process what
Mm,
happened and then to be believed, to
yeah,
really be seen, and then for someone to be moved by what you're telling them.
right. My way of looking at it has always been at the end of the day, everybody from top to bottom in the society, no matter how grown up and mature and worldly or developed or intelligent we might think we are, everybody at the end of the day is a 3-year-old kid who just wants to be picked up and held.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
our goal needs to be to figure out through that framework that we built up as we become adults, and notice how I put that in air quotes, as we become adults, to look through that framework and figure out what that hug looks like to us now.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a translation exercise to give, it's a translation exercise in how to give a 3-year-old a hug.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, that is absolutely true. And I think there are many, many psychological frameworks, right, that would use that inner child and
Mm-hmm.
talk about how that is oftentimes at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
Our inner child is terrified. It
yeah,
needs to be loved. It needs to know it's
mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah. And that's, I think anybody who says that they don't spend most of their day abjectly terrified by the world is probably not telling the truth either to you or to themselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think again, this goes back to me like so many people are just either repressing what's happening, right?
Mm.
Repression and denial are our
Yeah.
greatest assets in life, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Or it's we're dissociated, right? It's an unconscious repression. We don't even know it's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the difficulty.
Yeah.
It's the work that we all have.
That's one of the hardest things I think in ministry is the fact that it is so easy to know what needs to be done and so hard to actualize.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
It's like you never imagine how hard it's going to be to actually do the things that you can see so clearly. And
Mm.
I have worked with, in addition to my current congregation, I've worked with congregations that are in all states, all sorts of disrepair and collapse and infighting. I'm kind of quietly working with a congregation now that is literally ripping itself apart. And it all comes down to that inability to move beyond the theory, to know what you want to do, but to commit yourself to the actions necessary to do it. It's easy to say, I want a church that grows, or I want a church that is open and welcoming. But then you have to stop and think about what that actually means and do it. You want a church that grows? Well, growth means change. And that means that the way you've been acting for the last 50, 100, 150 years probably isn't working anymore. And you are going to need to get a new hymnal and maybe talk to some different people. If you want to be open and welcoming as a church, that doesn't just mean that you need to, reach a broader audience, whatever that means. It doesn't mean you need more advertising material. It means you got to start welcoming the LGBT community. It means you got to confront your internalized racism. You've got to welcome, local indigenous communities. You've got to do the work, not just say you want the thing. And the minute you tell people that, or the minute you try to do that yourself, fire and fury and flame. People are like, you don't change, don't make things be different. We want it exactly the same but bigger. And it's like, no, you have to do the work. And God has never shied away from telling us that that's exactly what we have to do. It's not just about saying, God, I want it, and God provides. It's about saying, God, I want it, and God saying, okay, well, here's the way you go. And if you don't want to go that way, I got a giant fish with your name on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which brings us right back to what you were saying earlier, right?
Yeah.
To pray thy will be done is to say, okay, well, now I'm going to go do it.
Yeah, exactly. What was it? I don't remember the exact quote, but it may seem odd for a very open and affirming Protestant pastor to quote the Pope, but there's a while back that Francis said something along the lines that like prayer without action is like useless. I don't remember the exact quote, but the basic gist of it was that if you pray and then refuse to take action, then your prayer is useless or something like that. And that, obviously not the word for word, but the idea behind it stuck with me this whole time. And that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's so true. I did. And that's, I mean, that's the real hard work
Yeah.
that none of us want to do.
Yeah. And it begins with, and this is the worst part, for ourselves and for our communities. The worst part is that it doesn't begin with outreach. We want it to begin with outreach, with going to the other and saying, hey, you're welcome here now. The first step of the process is internal.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go out until you fixed what's wrong inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you got to put your own oxygen mask on first.
The words of RuPaul, how the hell are you going to love somebody else if you can't love yourself?
Yeah. Or, how are you, the community, going to love other people
Mm-hmm.
if you haven't confronted why no one thinks you're loving in the first place?
Yep.
I've said this of churches on the broad scale, is people aren't, actually, I literally just had a conversation last night about why people are not coming to church, the nuns and the churchless now. Mm-hmm. It's not, as we say, that people are having less faith. It's because people have plenty of faith, plenty of belief in a higher power. They just don't feel welcomed by the church. As I told someone once in the midst of an argument, I know, shocker, I get in arguments with people. I said, it's not that they don't like God, they don't like you. Or they don't like us is really the case. And that's the hard bit that we have to wrestle with first. It's not that they don't like God, it's that they don't like us. And they have good reason for it. For generations, we've been giving people good reason to not like the church, because we've been telling them everything from, you're not welcome here unless you're a very specific type of person, to, hey, if you don't number 144,000, you're just basically marking time here. Whatever our theologies have been, it's been the same thing. It's been, you're welcome here to a point. Come on. And that nowadays people are just like, okay, well, fine, we'll get our communities elsewhere.
Yeah. Which is why it matters that you're doing the work that you're doing, that you're creating this other community for people to say,
well, I hope it matters. And I really do hope that in some small way, people out there can find a home with our community. In the end, I hope it's just not an exercise in ego and an excuse for me to try and do ministry and fandom stuff at the same time. We never know our own motivations perfectly. So, maybe that is what it is in the end. But I believe, and I hope that with my community there, that people can, I say my community, it's not about me. It's about being able to explore what it means to be Christian, really explore it, ask the hard questions, talk about these things that have hurt us, and understand, hopefully, and I really hope that the understanding can come eventually, that it wasn't God who hurt, it was people who hurt. And these people, I hate to use such binary terms, but these people who hurt were wrong. They were wrong about who God was, and they were human in their own ways, and they deserve their own forgiveness and their own reconciliation in the due course. But God is not a God who hurts. God is not a God who harms. God is a God who loves and who reconciles and brings people together. And that is the core of it. And if I am lucky enough that one or two people can find that with the community I'm trying to build here, then I will consider that a life well spent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's healing, right? That is moving into a brighter and better future.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I really do.
Oh, thank you so much, Don. I'm aware of the time. So just one last question that we can end on. If there's anything from your journey that you feel like has just been particularly useful that you just keep going back to, that grounds you. I know you shared that quote earlier, but is there another thing that you feel like you can just offer to people that you say, this idea or this quote or this piece of wisdom?
I don't have any one particular quote that would sum it up. So I'll do my best to articulate it in my own folksy, imperfect way. But it is this belief in that I have found in Christ that I want to share with others, that you are worth more than you think you are, to God and to yourself, and that you as a person, you deserve, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you've done, that you deserve the love and affection of God, which is made unilaterally and universally available to everyone, sure. But you also deserve to be part of a community of people who care for you. And if you are receiving that wherever you are, then that is a blessing and that is wonderful. But if you're not receiving that, it's not because you don't deserve. It is because you haven't found it yet, and you do deserve it, and you deserve to be upheld for a person who has, or as a person who has value, intrinsic value, not productive value. God, don't get me started on the capitalist mentality of productivity as personal value. But no,
That's the next
piece,
podcast.
Yeah, the one piece I want people to land on is that you matter, and you deserve to have a place, however big, however small, in your life, where you are affirmed for the fact that you matter.
Yeah, amen. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
If people want to find out more about your community, where would they go?
Well, I will. I'll text you the links here, so I'm sure you'll want to drop them in the description as well. But our website right now is a little bit of a long one. It's pastorkuma.wixsite.com/unfinished. You can find us at Unfinished KIPC on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at Pastor Kuma. Still using my personal ones for that, but hey, still a lot of fun. We also do have our own podcast, which is right now being used mostly for sermon distribution, but we're working behind the scenes on building some more content for that as well. And that you can find at Anchor FM/Pastor Kuma, or you can search for Unfinished pretty much anywhere you get podcasts. So that covers the most of our pluggables there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.